In June of 1861, two crews left from opposite ends of the United States. One left from Omaha, Nebraska, the other left from Fort Churchill, Nevada. Each crew was hauling wagons full of wooden poles, copper wire, and glass insulators. They were trying to meet in the middle. The total distance between them was roughly 1,800 miles. Most of that distance ran through Sioux Territory, Cheyenne Territory, Shoshone Territory, and stretches of high desert and mountain pass where no telegraph pole had ever stood. The crews had no machinery. They had wagons, oxen, hand augers, axes, and approximately 27,500 wooden poles that needed to go into the ground one at a time. In the next 4 months, those two crews set every single one of those poles, strung over 2,000 miles of single-strand iron wire, and met at Salt Lake City on the 24th of October, 1861. That evening, Stephen J. Field, the Chief Justice of California, sent a message to President Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C. The message traveled from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic coast in a matter of minutes. Just months earlier, that same message would have taken weeks by stagecoach or 10 days by the fastest riders the Pony Express could field. The man who managed the Eastern crew was named Edward Creighton. He was born on a farm in Belmont County, Ohio, in 1820, and by 1856 he had become one of the largest builders of telegraph lines in the United States. The man who managed the Western crew was James Gamble, an experienced telegraph builder out of California. Creighton and Gamble had placed personal bets on who would reach Salt Lake City first. Creighton won by 7 days. The entire project cost $500,000. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $18 million today. The men who dug the holes, set the poles, and strung the wire were paid about $1 a day plus rations. Some of them never came home. This is how America built 1,000-mile telegraph lines before radio existed. To understand why anyone would attempt something this ambitious in the summer of 1861, you need to understand what the world felt like before the telegraph connected it. Because if you lived in the United States in 1840, information moved at the speed of a horse. That was it. That was the ceiling. In 1841, President William Henry Harrison died in office. It took 110 days for the news to reach Los Angeles. 110 days. A president died, and the western half of the country did not know about it for nearly 4 months. Gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in January of 1848. The federal government did not confirm the discovery until December. 16 months passed before the so-called 49 ERs began flooding into California from the eastern states, because that is how long it took for reliable information to travel overland and by ship. By the 1850s, you had a country that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and the two halves could barely talk to each other. If you were a merchant in New York and you needed to send a message to a business partner in San Francisco, your options were a clipper ship around Cape Horn, which took about 45 days, or an overland stagecoach from St. Louis, which took more than 20 days. Either way, by the time your message arrived, the situation you were writing about had probably changed completely. Now, the eastern half of the country already had telegraph. Samuel Morse had demonstrated his first experimental line between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore on the 24th of May, 1844. The message he sent was 4 words: "What hath God wrought?" Within a decade, telegraph wires connected most major cities east of the Mississippi. You could send a message from New York to Chicago in minutes, but the moment you hit the Great Plains, the wire stopped. Everything west of there was silence. California had built its own small telegraph network by 1853, connecting San Francisco to Sacramento and Marysville. But between the Missouri River and the Sierra Nevada, there was nothing. Over 1,000 miles of grass, rock, desert, and mountains with no wire on it. The Pony Express launched in April of 1860, and it was considered a miracle. Young men on fast horses, riding in relays, could carry a letter from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California in about 10 days. The route covered nearly 2,000 miles, used about 190 relay stations, and required roughly 400 horses. Each rider covered 75 to 100 miles before handing off the mail pouch to the next man. The charge was $5 per half ounce of mail. In $1860, that is the equivalent of about $180 today for a single letter. It was fast. It was daring. It was also a financial catastrophe. Russell, Majors, and Waddell, the firm behind the Pony Express, lost roughly $200,000 on the venture. They made about $90,000 in revenue. The math never worked. But it proved something important. It proved that a central overland route could be operated year-round, even through the Rocky Mountains, even through the Great Basin. It proved the corridor was viable. And that corridor is exactly where the telegraph lines would go. Now, the idea of a transcontinental telegraph was not new. People had been talking about it in Congress since the 1850s. The problem was that nobody wanted to pay for it, and nobody could agree on a route. Southern politicians wanted a southern route. Northern politicians wanted a northern route. The debate mirrored the same fight happening over the Transcontinental Railroad, and for the same reasons. But by 1860, the country was on the edge of civil war, and the federal government desperately needed a way to communicate with California. California had been a state since 1850. It had gold, it had ports, it had a growing population, and it was functionally cut off from Washington for weeks at a time. If California was going to stay loyal to the Union, the government needed a way to reach it faster than by horseback. So, in June of 1860, Congress passed the Pacific Telegraph Act. It authorized the U.S. Post Office to spend $40,000 per year for 10 years to subsidize a company willing to build and maintain an overland telegraph line from Missouri to California. California's state legislature had already authorized its own subsidy of $6,000 per year. The total government support was modest. $40,000 a year was not going to build 1,800 miles of telegraph line. The total construction cost would end up being $500,000. The subsidy was a commitment, a handshake from the federal government saying this matters enough for us to put money behind it. But the real profit would come from operating the line once it was built, and that profit would be enormous. Telegrams cost $1 per word. A single message of 20 words cost more than 3 weeks of a laborer's wages. Newspapers, banks, trading firms, the military, railroads, every institution that depended on fast information would become a customer instantly. Whoever built this line would own the most valuable communication corridor in North America. The man who stepped forward was Hiram Sibley. Sibley was the president of Western Union, a company he had built by spending the 1850s systematically buying up, merging, and consolidating dozens of small, regional telegraph companies into a single national network. By 1856, Sibley had merged his New York and Mississippi Valley Printing Telegraph Company with Ezra Cornell's competing firm, and at Cornell's insistence, the merged company was renamed the Western Union Telegraph Company. Western Union, as its name suggests, was built on the idea of unifying the telegraph systems of the western states. Sibley understood that whoever connected the East Coast to California would control the most valuable communication line in the country. He was the only serious bidder. Every competitor withdrew. Theodore Adams, Benjamin Ficklin, John Harmon, all of them pulled out. Sibley won the contract. But Sibley was not a builder. He was a financier. For the actual construction, he turned to Edward Creighton. Creighton had started his working life at age 14 as a cart boy. By 18, his father had given him a wagon and a team of horses, and he became a freighter. In 1847, he watched 2 Irish Americans erecting telegraph lines for a company owned by Henry O'Reilly, and something about the work caught his attention. He started taking contracts to deliver telegraph poles. Then he started building short lines himself. By the mid-1850s, he had built more telegraph lines than almost anyone else in the country. He knew the work, he knew the terrain, and in the winter of 1860 to 1861, Sibley sent him west to survey the entire route from Omaha to California. Think about what that survey involved. Creighton rode on horseback through the middle of winter, across the Great Plains, through the South Pass of the Rocky Mountains, across the high desert of what is now Wyoming and Utah, all the way to the Pacific coast. He was measuring distances. He was identifying timber sources for poles. He was negotiating with Native American leaders whose lands the line would cross. He was making arrangements with Brigham Young in Salt Lake City for Mormon workers to supply poles for the Utah section of the route. When he came back, he had a plan. The line would be built in 2 halves. The Pacific Telegraph Company, under Creighton's supervision, would build westward from Omaha, following the Platte River to Fort Kearny, then to Fort Laramie, up the Sweetwater River to South Pass, and on to Salt Lake City. That was roughly 1,100 miles. The Overland Telegraph Company, under James Gamble's supervision, would build eastward from Fort Churchill, Nevada, through Ruby Valley, Egan Canyon, and Deep Creek, following the route of the Pony Express to Salt Lake City. That was roughly 600 miles, shorter in distance, but crossing some of the most brutal terrain on the continent. Both crews would race toward Salt Lake City. Whoever arrived first won bragging rights. Construction officially began on the 4th of July, 1861. Creighton dug the first post hole himself. If you want to understand the physical reality of what these crews did every day for 4 months, you need to picture it very precisely, because there was nothing mechanized about this process. Every step was done by hand, by animal, and by sheer physical stubbornness. The construction moved like a slow parade across the open country. James Gamble described the method himself in an 1881 account. He wrote that the line was first measured and staked off. The hole diggers followed. Then came the pole setters. And next came the wire party. That is, 4 separate crews working in sequence, one behind the other, spread out across miles of open country. The first crew was the survey team. They went ahead with measuring chains and stakes, marking the exact spot where each pole would stand. The poles were spaced roughly 75 yards apart. That means every mile of line required approximately 23 poles. Over the full 1,800-mile gap, they needed approximately 27,500 poles in total. Behind the survey team came the auger crew. These men carried hand augers, the kind you twist into the ground with both hands and your full body weight. They drilled holes 4 feet deep at each stake. 4 feet by hand into prairie sod, into rocky soil, into the hard alkaline crust of the Great Basin. If they hit rock, they broke it with pickaxes, or they moved the stake a few feet and tried again. If they hit soft sand, the hole would not hold a pole, and they had to find a way to stabilize it with packed rock and gravel. There were no power tools. There were no jackhammers. There were no diesel drills. There were men, there were augers, and there was the ground. In July, on the Nebraska plains, the ground temperature at the surface can exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit. The men drilling those holes worked with blistered hands, sunburned necks, and alkaline dust in their lungs. Behind the auger crew came the pole-setting team. The poles were 25 to 30 feet long, typically cut from pine or cedar, and they were heavy. A green pine pole of that length weighs several hundred pounds. Each pole had to be lifted upright, dropped into its 4-foot hole, and packed tight with soil, rocks, and whatever fill the crew could find. Sometimes they used tripod rigs made from other poles to lever them upright. Sometimes they used horse teams to pull them up with ropes. Sometimes it was just 6 or 8 men muscling a log vertical and holding it while others packed the base. If the packing was not tight enough, the pole leaned. If the pole leaned, the wire sagged. If the wire sagged, it could touch the ground or another wire and short out the signal. Every pole had to be plumb. And then came the wire crew. They strung a single strand of iron wire from pole to pole, attaching it at each pole with glass insulators mounted on wooden crossarms. The insulators were small, shaped like upside-down cups, and they kept the electrical current in the wire from bleeding into the wood and dissipating into the ground. If an insulator cracked, if it fell off, if it was shot by a hunter or knocked off by a bird, the signal degraded. Every single one of the 27,500 insulators had to be intact for the line to carry a clear signal from one end to the other. The wire crew also had to maintain tension. Too much slack, and the wire drooped dangerously between poles. Too much tension, and it snapped in cold weather when the metal contracted. Now here is the problem that nearly broke the entire project. The Great Plains and the Great Basin are treeless. You can stand on a high point in central Nebraska or central Nevada and see for 50 miles in every direction, and there is not a tree in sight. Gamble himself wrote that along portions of the route, the mountains and plains were treeless as far as the eye could reach, even from the highest point. Where, he asked, the poles were to come from, he could not conceive. On the eastern end, Creighton stockpiled thousands of poles in Omaha and freighted them westward by wagon. Imagine that. Wagon after wagon, loaded with 3 0-foot logs, pulled by oxen across the Nebraska prairie. Each wagon could carry a limited number of poles. The wagons had to keep pace with the construction crews or the whole operation stopped. On the western end, the problem was even worse. The wire and glass insulators had been manufactured in the eastern United States, shipped by sea all the way around Cape Horn to San Francisco, and then hauled by wagon train eastward over the Sierra Nevada. Gamble described an expedition that left on the 27th of May, 1861, with 228 oxen, 26 wagons, 50 men, and several horses. The train was very long, the road narrow, and many of the wagons were too heavily laden for mountain roads. A 1-2 day estimated crossing of the mountains took nearly a month. For the Utah sections, Creighton negotiated with Brigham Young to supply poles. Young contracted with local Mormon suppliers who knew where to find timber in the canyons and gorges of the Wasatch Range. Stunted pine and quaking aspen, dragged out of mountain gullies and hauled by wagon to the line. When some of Young's contractors tried to back out, complaining the pay was insufficient, Young publicly denounced them from the pulpit and reassigned the work to other parties. Water was another crisis. In the desert sections of Nevada and western Utah, there was no water. Period. It had to be hauled in by wagon for the construction crews working through the summer of 1861. You had men digging holes in 100-degree heat, setting 30-foot poles in alkaline desert, and the water they drank came from a barrel on a wagon that might have been filled 40 miles back. And then there were the storms. Lightning was a constant threat, and not an abstract one. The men were setting tall wooden poles topped with iron wire on flat, exposed ground during summer thunderstorms on the Great Plains. They were, in the most literal sense, building lightning rods across 1,000 miles of open country. The wire attracted strikes, the poles attracted strikes, the men holding the wire attracted strikes. When a bolt hit the line, it could travel for miles along the wire, blowing insulators off poles, splitting poles in half, and killing anyone touching the line. The sound of a lightning strike on an iron telegraph wire is not like anything else. It is a crack that hits your chest before your ears register it, followed by the hum of the wire vibrating at a frequency you can feel in your teeth. On the western section, one of the Native American workers hired by the Overland Telegraph Company grabbed a live wire and was knocked off his feet by the electrical shock. He warned his companions about the evil spirits inhabiting the wire. Telegraph Company officials, rather than explaining the science, tried to exploit the superstition. They told tribal leaders that the humming wires carried the voice of the Great Spirit Manitou. They arranged for 2 chiefs, one at Fort Laramie and one at Fort Bridger, to exchange messages via telegraph. When the chiefs met at the halfway point between the 2 forts, they were astonished to discover that their messages had actually traveled over the wires and arrived before they did. These crews did not work in a vacuum. They were building through territory that belonged to other nations. The Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Shoshone, and the Paiute all had claims on the land the line crossed, and their reactions to the telegraph were complicated. In some cases, Creighton negotiated directly with tribal leaders. He was known for establishing what were described as friendly relationships with several tribes along the route. His Wikipedia entry notes that he championed the cause of Native Americans throughout his life and spoke out against their mistreatment, a stance that put him in conflict with the U.S. Army and local politicians, including his own brother. In some cases, tribal leaders cooperated. A Shoshone chief named Shokup reportedly sent a telegram via the existing line out of Carson City, saying that his people would not trouble the telegraph line and that he was a friend of the white man. But in other cases, the line was attacked. In the summer of 1861, a party of Sioux warriors cut a section of the completed line and took a long stretch of wire. They used the stolen wire to make bracelets. When some of the Sioux who wore the bracelets fell ill, their medicine man attributed the sickness to the spirit of the talking wire. After that, according to several sources, there was less trouble from that particular group. But the broader pattern continued. Native Americans cut the line repeatedly in the years that followed, both as acts of resistance and as part of broader hostilities with the U.S. Army. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln requested that a Utah militia of 90 men, led by a Mormon battalion veteran named Captain Lot Smith, protect the telegraph lines between Fort Bridger and Fort Laramie. Another enemy of the telegraph line, and this one is almost absurd in its simplicity, was the American bison. Buffalo herds roaming the plains would rub against the telegraph poles. A 2,000-pound bull, scratching itself against a wooden post tends to push the post over. Entire sections of the line were brought down by herds of bison using the poles as scratching posts. This was a problem for years. And then there was the Civil War. The telegraph line was being built through the summer and fall of 1861, the same months the war was exploding in the East. The Battle of Bull Run happened on July 21st, while Creighton's crews were setting poles along the Platte River. The battles at Wilson's Creek and Ball's Bluff happened during the construction period. Fort Sumter had been fired on just 3 months before the first pole went into the ground. This was not an abstract concern for the telegraph crews. Confederate sympathizers in Missouri attempted to cut the telegraph line to disrupt Union communications, forcing the entire network to be rerouted through Chicago. Southern politicians who had spent years blocking a northern route for the telegraph were now actively sabotaging the one that got built. Labor was hard to find because men were enlisting. Supplies were scarce because the war consumed everything. The same wagons, the same oxen, the same iron wire that Creighton needed for telegraph poles were being requisitioned by the War Department for military use. And here is the irony. The Union needed this telegraph line precisely because there was a civil war. California had gold, ports, and manpower. If California sided with the Confederacy, or even if it simply declared neutrality, the Union's strategic position would have been devastated. Lincoln needed to communicate with the West Coast in real time. He needed to know that California's governor and legislators were loyal. He needed to issue orders and receive intelligence without a month-long delay. Creighton and Gamble built through all of it. Creighton's eastern crew covered their 1,100 miles first. The Pacific Telegraph Company's line reached Salt Lake City on the 18th of October, 1861. Gamble's western crew, slowed by the Sierra Nevada, the desert, and the challenge of hauling supplies across some of the most remote terrain in North America, completed their section on October 24th. In the final weeks, with winter approaching and both crews knowing that being caught in the open by early snow could be fatal, the pace became frantic. The prospect of a bone-chilling winter in the wilderness spurred both crews forward. Gamble's men were closing a 60-mile gap between Ruby Valley and Shell Creek in central Nevada, some of the most desolate country any of them had ever seen. That evening, the wires were connected. The continent was linked. A small crowd gathered at the telegraph office in Salt Lake City at about 68 South Main Street to witness the first messages transmitted by electricity across the full breadth of the nation. Stephen J. Field sent the first transcontinental telegram to President Lincoln. He assured the President of California's loyalty to the Union and said that the telegraph would be the means of strengthening the attachment which binds both the East and the West. Horace W. Carpentier, president of the Overland Telegraph Company, sent his own message announcing the completion. Lincoln, who had once predicted the line could never be built, who had said it would be impossible to get poles across the prairies and that Indians would not leave them in place, was so taken with the new technology that he began calling telegrams lightning messages. During major battles in the years that followed, Lincoln sometimes slept on a cot in the War Department telegraph office, waiting for news from the front. 2 days after the transcontinental telegraph was completed, on the 26th of October, 1861, the Pony Express announced its closure. The most romantic mail service in American history, the riders and fast horses that had captured the national imagination, was finished, killed instantly by a copper wire humming between wooden poles. The Pony Express had been in operation for 18 months. It had made 308 complete runs, covering roughly 616,000 miles, the equivalent of circling the Earth more than 30 times. It had lost only one bag of mail in the entire run, and it ceased to matter the moment 2 wires touched in Salt Lake City. The riders who had earned $125 a month, good wages for the time, were suddenly out of work. Some of them enlisted in the Civil War. Johnny Fry, one of the original Pony Express riders, quit and joined Union forces in Kansas as a courier. He was later killed in a shootout with Missouri raiders near Baxter Springs. The firm behind the Pony Express, Russell, Majors, and Waddell, was already bankrupt. The telegraph did not kill them financially. They were dead before it arrived, but it buried them. In 1866, what remained of their assets was sold to Wells Fargo for $1.5 million. The overland stagecoach mail dropped to weekly service. The entire business model of carrying physical messages across the continent at speed was obsolete overnight. Not in a year, not gradually, overnight. A technology that had existed for less than 2 years was wiped out by a technology that had been under construction for 4 months. That is how fast the world changed on the 24th of October, 1861. If you are watching this and finding it valuable, hit the subscribe button. There is more like this coming. The financial impact of the transcontinental telegraph was immediate and staggering. Telegrams initially cost $1 per word. Businesses, newspapers, railroads, and the federal government immediately became dependent on the line. Western Union's stock price surged. Between 1,860 and 1,864, cash dividends ranged from 3 to 11%, and the value of Western Union's stock soared by 133%. By 1864, the company operated on 44,000 miles of wire and was valued at $10 million. Within a year, its worth jumped to $21 million. Between 1,857 and 1,867, the company's value grew by an estimated 11,000%. By 1866, Western Union had absorbed its last 2 major competitors, the American Telegraph Company and the United States Telegraph Company, and controlled 90% of all telegraph traffic in the United States. It operated roughly 100,000 miles of wire. One of its telegraph operators during this period was a young man named Thomas Edison, whose early inventions were developed while working for Western Union. The company kept expanding. In 1866, it launched the first stock ticker, feeding New York Stock Exchange quotes to brokerage firms. In 1870, it introduced a standardized time service, because before the telegraph, different cities kept different times. In 1871, it launched its money transfer service, a service that is still in operation today under the Western Union name. By 1900, Western Union operated 1 million miles of telegraph lines and 2 international undersea cables. Yearly messages sent over its lines had grown from 5.8 million in 1867 to 63.2 million in 1900. Transmission rates had dropped from an average of $1.09 per message to 30 cents. Even at those lower prices, 30 to 40 cents of every dollar was pure profit. All of it built on the foundation of those 27,500 poles set by hand in the summer of 1861. But I want to take you back to that summer for a moment, because the men who built this line are not the ones who got rich from it. Edward Creighton became enormously wealthy. He used his telegraph holdings as the foundation for investments in banking, ranching, railroads, and real estate. He became the first president of the First National Bank of Omaha. He and his brother John invested heavily in the Union Pacific Railroad, which would follow a route parallel to their telegraph line. When Edward died in 1874, at the age of 54, his fortune funded the creation of Creighton University, which still operates in Omaha today. Hiram Sibley made his fortune too. So did Jephthah Wade, Ezra Cornell, and the other financiers behind Western Union. Cornell used his telegraph wealth to found Cornell University. These are the names that survived. The men who dug the post holes are mostly anonymous. The men who hauled poles by ox cart across 500 miles of treeless prairie are not in the history books. The men who strung wire in thunderstorms on the open plains, who hauled water barrels through desert heat for $1-a-day wages, who packed 4-foot holes with rock and sand and bare hands to keep a 3-0-foot pole upright, those men did not endow universities. They did not get stock options. They did not get their names on buildings. Some of them were immigrants, Irish and German, following the same path west that so many others took in the 1860s. Some of them were frontiersmen who had been making a living as freighters and trail guides. Some of them were Mormon laborers recruited by Brigham Young, men who cut stunted pine out of mountain gullies with handsaws and dragged it to the line by mule. Some of them were former Pony Express station workers who had already lost one job to the march of technology and were now literally building its replacement. Charles Brown was one of them. He kept a diary. It was recently rediscovered in the Smithsonian Institution's collections and published by the Nebraska State Historical Society. It is the only known extensive first-hand account of the day-to-day construction of the transcontinental telegraph. Brown's diary covers the section from Julesburg, Colorado, through Chimney Rock and Scotts Bluff, past Fort Laramie. He wrote about the individuals he met, the road ranches, the difficulties facing the construction crews, the nature of frontier law enforcement, attitudes toward Native Americans, and the arguments about secession and civil war that followed the crews across the plains. He wrote with detail and personality, the kind of writing that comes from a man who knew he was part of something worth recording, even if he could not have known how quickly the world would forget. Brown's diary is a reminder that these were real men, doing real physical labor, in real danger, for $1 a day, and his is the only account that survived. Think about that. Out of all the hundreds of men who built this line, across 4 months and 1,800 miles, one of them wrote it down, and we nearly lost that too. If you have been watching this far, consider subscribing. I cover stories like this every week, the forgotten labor that built the systems we take for granted. The telegraph line that Creighton and Gamble completed in 1861 was a single strand of iron wire on wooden poles. It was fragile. Lightning brought sections down. Wind brought sections down. Snow brought sections down. Bison brought sections down. Native American raids brought sections down. Confederate saboteurs brought sections down. It required constant maintenance. But it worked. And it changed everything. Before the 24th of October, 1861, the United States was functionally two countries divided by time. The East moved at one pace, and the West moved at another, and the gap between them was measured in weeks. A financial panic in New York did not reach San Francisco for a month. A battle in Virginia did not reach California for weeks. A presidential election was decided before most Westerners even knew the candidates had finished campaigning. After the 24th of October, 1861, a message from Washington could reach San Francisco in minutes. Newspapers on both coasts could print the same story on the same day. Military orders could be sent and received in near real time. Financial markets could react to the same information simultaneously. The country, in a very literal sense, became one country. The transcontinental telegraph was operational as a single line until 1869, when the first transcontinental railroad was completed. At that point, a more advanced multi-wire telegraph system was built alongside the railroad route, and the original line was rendered obsolete. It had served for 8 years as the only high-speed link between East and West. But those 8 years changed the infrastructure of the nation permanently. By the time the original line was replaced, telegraph lines crisscrossed the entire country. Every major city had a telegraph office. Every railroad used telegraph dispatching. Every newspaper relied on telegraph reports. The Associated Press was built on telegraph communication. Financial markets were transformed by it. The entire concept of a national economy, a single market responding to the same information at the same time, was made possible by telegraph wire on wooden poles. And the expansion was relentless. In 1866, Western Union's network covered about 100,000 miles of wire. By the 1880s, telegraph lines connected practically every town and city in the country. By 1900, 1 million miles of wire. The telegraph separated communication from transportation for the first time in human history. Before the telegraph, a message could only travel as fast as the person carrying it. After the telegraph, a message traveled at the speed of electricity. That was a conceptual revolution, not just a technological one. It changed how people thought about distance, about time, about what it meant to be connected. The telephone came in 1876. Alexander Graham Bell offered to sell his patent to Western Union for $100,000. Western Union refused. It is one of the worst business decisions in American history. By 1900, there were 600,000 telephones in use. By 1910, 5.8 million. Transcontinental telephone service was established in 1915. The telephone did not kill the telegraph overnight, but it began the long decline. By 1945, telegram traffic was half of what it had been at its peak. Western Union eventually abandoned telegraphy entirely and reinvented itself as a money transfer company. It sent its last telegram in 2006. Today, the route of Interstate 80 runs along the course Edward Creighton's telegraph line took in 1861. If you drive that highway across Nebraska and Wyoming and Utah, you are following the same corridor those pole-setting crews worked, the same corridor the Pony Express riders galloped, The same corridor the wagon trains rolled through with their loads of 30-foot pine poles and barrels of water. You will not see the original poles. Almost all of them are gone. A few stumps survive in the area around South Pass in Wyoming, weathered down to gray stubs barely a foot high, barely recognizable as the remains of the infrastructure that connected a continent. There are no markers, there are no plaques, there is no monument to the auger crews, or the wire stringers, or the men who drove ox carts full of telegraph poles across 500 miles of grassland. The land has reclaimed almost everything they built. Buried beneath the highway, and beneath the fields on either side, are fiber optic cables that carry more data in a single second than the entire transcontinental telegraph carried in a year. The principle is the same. A signal traveling through a medium, stretched across the distance between two coasts. The execution is different by a factor of billions, but the idea, the fundamental insight that you could send a message faster than a horse could carry it, that idea was proven on the 24th of October 1861 by men with blistered hands and $1-a-day wages. We send a message across the country today and it arrives in milliseconds. We do not think about it. We do not think about the infrastructure that makes it possible. We do not think about the poles, the wires, the satellite relays, the undersea cables, the server farms. We certainly do not think about the men who built the first version of it, who dug the first holes and set the first poles and strung the first wire across land that had never seen anything like it. Edward Creighton dug the first post hole on the 2nd of July, 1861, outside Omaha, Nebraska. 114 days later, the continent was wired. He did it with hand augers, horse teams, ox carts, and men who worked for $1 a day in thunderstorms, in desert heat, in country where they were not welcome and where no pole had ever stood. They did not have radios. They did not have telephones. They did not have paved roads. They did not have weather forecasts. They did not have power tools. They had axes, wire, glass insulators, and the ground beneath their feet. The ground is still there. The poles are gone. The wire is gone. The men are gone. But the connection they built, the idea that a message could cross a continent in minutes instead of months, that idea never went away. It just got faster. And nobody remembers the men who made it possible the first time. If you want to see how another group of forgotten workers built something equally impossible with nothing but their hands and their stubbornness, click the video on screen now. And if you made it to the end, subscribe. There is more of this coming.